Welcome to the Enigma of the Elusive Botanist, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series The Feminine Mystique. Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, playing in the year 1892. It was during certain renovations at our old Baker Street lodgings, some years after Mr. Sherlock Holmes's retirement, that a rather unassuming trunk was brought down from the attic. Within, to my considerable surprise, lay a collection of personal diaries and letters, penned by various women whose lives had, in one way or another, intersected with Holmes's investigations during those eventful years spanning from 1888 to 1914. These intimate accounts, offering perspectives often differing from my own published chronicles, illuminate the thoughts, feelings, and indeed the behind-the-scenes actions of women navigating the societal constraints of our era, women who frequently challenged Holmes's own assumptions. This collection, which I have come to think of as the feminine mystique, Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, reveals their unique stories. Allow me, then, to present the first of these rediscovered narratives, a most curious affair concerning a brilliant mind, which I have designated the enigma of the elusive botanist. Chapter 1. A persistent, chilling fog enveloped London that late autumn, seeping through every crack and crevice. This miasma seemed to mirror the obscurity soon to cloud a most singular case. I recall an afternoon, gas lamps already sputtering against the grey dimness outside our Baker Street windows. The usual quiet of our lodgings was disturbed only by the distant, rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones and the occasional mournful hoot of a steamer from the Thames, save for the rustle of Holmes's newspaper as he scanned the agony columns, his brow furrowed. Suddenly, a sharp, familiar rap upon our door announced Mrs. Hudson. She entered, her expression one of mild flurry, a common sight when faced with the unconventionalities of Holmes's profession. "Mr. Holmes, there is a Lady Helena Winthrop downstairs. She is most insistent upon seeing you. She awaits in my salon. It seems a matter of some urgency concerning one of her protégées," Mrs. Hudson said. Holmes raised an eyebrow, interest diverted from the page. Mrs. Hudson's salon, her grand term for the downstairs parlor when hosting her suffragist associates, was an unusual venue for his consultations. From that quarter, one usually heard earnest debate and the clinking of teacups, not the hushed tones of clients. Lady Helena Winthrop. Ah, yes, a patron of the sciences with a particular interest in female advancement. Mrs. Hudson, we shall meet her downstairs. Come, Watson, a change of scenery might prove stimulating, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. We found Lady Helena Winthrop by the fireplace in Mrs. Hudson's parlor. The room, usually smelling faintly of beeswax and Earl Grey, with its embroidered cushions and potted ferns, now felt charged with anxious energy. Lady Helena, a woman of middle years, possessed a commanding presence, her attire elegant yet severe. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear, carrying profound disquiet. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for agreeing to see me on such short notice. I fear I am quite beside myself with worry. It concerns a Miss Imogen Finch, a botanist of quite extraordinary talent," replied Lady Helena Winthrop. "A botanist, you say?" stated Sherlock Holmes. His tone was neutral, yet I detected a familiar flicker of intellectual curiosity beneath the composed exterior. He gestured towards a chair. "Indeed, Miss Finch was on the cusp of a discovery, Mr. Holmes, one that could revolutionize pharmacology. She has developed compounds from Amazonian flora with remarkable analgesic properties. She was to present her paper tomorrow, but she has vanished. Simply vanished from her laboratory, which was found locked from the inside." Lady Helena Winthrop answered. Lady Helena's voice trembled slightly on the last words. In the ensuing silence, the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall seemed to grow louder, amplifying the tension. "Locked from the inside. Good heavens," Dr. John Watson said. Her male colleagues, I regret to say, dismiss it as a fit of nerves, an emotional flight of fancy before a significant presentation. They do not comprehend the steel within Imogen, nor the immense value of her work. But I know her, Mr. Holmes. This is not some whim. I fear foul play, replied Lady Helena Winthrop. Holmes steepled his fingers, gaze fixed on Lady Helena. I braced myself, fearing he might dismiss the affair with some remark on feminine instability under pressure, a prejudice he sometimes harbored despite his respect for individual intellect. A locked laboratory, you say, and her research potentially revolutionary and therefore valuable. This presents certain points of interest beyond mere feminine caprice. Tell me everything, Lady Helena, from the very beginning, and omit no detail, however trivial it may seem, observed Sherlock Holmes. The sharp, decisive tone returned to Holmes's voice. His languor vanished. The game was afoot. Lady Helena visibly relaxed, a soft sigh escaping her. As she began her account, the familiar scent of Mrs. Hudson's Earl Grey tea mingled with the charged air of impending mystery. Our quiet afternoon was over. The enigma of Miss Imogen Finch now gripped Sherlock Holmes. Despite his initial reservations, Holmes had agreed with surprising alacrity to investigate the disappearance of Miss Imogen Finch. The following morning, a chill November wind howled around the eaves and whistled through the cracks of our hansom cab. The cab clattered to a halt before a modest terraced house in a quiet Bloomsbury Street, the sound of its wheels on the cobbles ceasing abruptly. This, we were informed by the solemn constable at the door, whose voice was nearly lost to a gust, was the residence and laboratory of the missing botanist. As we entered the laboratory at the rear of the house, a scene of peculiar order greeted us. Through the windows, we glimpsed a small, somewhat overgrown conservatory. Light streamed in from the glass roof of the adjoining structure, illuminating benches laden with scientific apparatus. Neatly labeled jars stood in rows, and presses overflowed with dried specimens. The gentle hum of a Bunsen burner, left on low, could be faintly discerned beneath the other sounds. The air hung heavy with the mixed scents of damp earth, chemicals, and the faint, sweet perfume of exotic blooms. What struck me immediately, however, was the profound silence that otherwise dominated the space. It was broken only by the rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the conservatory, and from outside, the distant, mournful cry of a street vendor hawking his wares. His voice was low and thoughtful as he surveyed the room. Locked from the inside, you say, officer, and the windows, stated Sherlock Holmes. The constable, a stout fellow whose ruddy face was etched with bewilderment, confirmed Holmes's query. His voice, when he spoke, was a gravelly baritone, carrying the unmistakable cadence of a born-and-bred Londoner. Aye, that's the long and short of it, Mr. Holmes. Locked from the inside, every window latched, every door bolted. Checked it myself thrice over. Not so much as a mouse could have slipped in or out. It's as if she just evaporated, sir. Clean into the ether, replied Constable. Holmes moved with swift, silent steps, his keen eyes darting from one object to another. He ran a finger along a window ledge, the slight rasp of skin on dusty wood barely audible. He then examined the sturdy lock on the laboratory door, its brass gleaming dully under the diffuse light. He peered intently at the floorboards. The only other sounds in the immediate vicinity were the soft rustle of his coat as he moved, and the faint creak of the aged floor beneath his weight, each small noise amplified in the stillness. Into thin air, Holmes mused. Sherlock Holmes said. He tapped a section of wall adjoining the conservatory, or perhaps through a less obvious aperture. The construction here is older. A hidden panel, a disused passage. Unlikely to be unknown to the occupant, yet a possibility for extraction, willing or otherwise. Observe, Watson, the meticulous arrangement. No sign of a struggle. Everything is in its designated place, save for Miss Finch herself. Sherlock Holmes responded. His attention then fell upon a large wooden desk. Its surface was covered with notebooks and loose sheets of paper, filled with precise, spidery handwriting and intricate botanical drawings. A faint, dry scent of old paper and pressed flowers emanated from them. Holmes picked up a sheaf of notes, the crisp rustle of the paper a sharp sound in the quiet room. His brow furrowed in concentration. Amongst the detailed descriptions of plant physiology, one particular sketch caught my eye. It depicted an orchid of breathtaking, almost ethereal beauty, rendered with exceptional care. The drawing detailed its delicate, almost translucent petals, an intricate pattern of veining unlike any I had seen, and a peculiar, almost predatory twist to its central labellum. Even in monochrome, the artist had conveyed a sense of vibrant, otherworldly life. Her current research, I presume, he murmured, more to himself than to me. Fascinating, this particular species, unusual, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Before I could inquire further, a hesitant knock sounded at the laboratory door, which the constable had left ajar. A young woman stood framed in the doorway, her expression a mixture of anxiety and determination. She was plainly dressed, but her eyes were bright and intelligent. This, I surmised, was Miss Rosie O'Malley, the laboratory assistant Lady Winthrop had mentioned. Her voice was soft, yet possessed a clear, educated tone that belied her youthful appearance. "Mr. Holmes, I was told you would be here. I worked for Miss Finch," Miss Rosie O'Malley answered. "Indeed, Miss O'Malley, pray come in. Any light you can shed upon this perplexing matter would be invaluable." "When did you last see Miss Finch?" stated Sherlock Holmes. Miss O'Malley stepped inside. The light tap of her sensible shoes on the wooden floorboards a brief counterpoint to the room's stillness. Her gaze swept worriedly around the familiar room as she clutched a small, worn satchel to her chest, the leather creaking faintly. "The evening before last, sir. She was agitated, more so than usual. She was due to present her paper on the Amazonian flora at the Linnean Society. It was to be a triumph." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word. Miss Rosie O'Malley said. "Agitated in what way, Miss O'Malley?" I asked gently. Responded Dr. John Watson. "She spoke of pressure, sir, of feeling watched, and there was Dr. Blackwood." She hesitated, her brow creasing with concern, remarked Miss Rosie O'Malley. "Dr. Alistair Blackwood," Holmes prompted, his tone neutral yet expectant, declared Sherlock Holmes. "Yes, sir, a rival botanist. He's shown an uncommonly keen interest in Miss Finch's work these past few months, always asking questions, trying to glean details about her analgesic research. Miss Finch found his persistence unsettling. She said his inquiries felt less like scientific curiosity and more like, well, she didn't say, but I felt it, sir, a sort of desperate edge to him," said Miss Rosie O'Malley. Holmes listened intently, his fingers steepled before him. He made no immediate comment on Miss O'Malley's suspicions, but I saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. The seed of a new line of inquiry had clearly been planted. "Unsubstantiated, of course, but noted," he said finally, his voice crisp. "This Dr. Blackwood, he is a member of the Linnean Society, I presume," Sherlock Holmes noted. "Oh, yes, sir. Quite prominent, though his own company has been struggling, or so I've heard whispered," responded Miss Rosie O'Malley. Holmes nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression settling upon his features. For a moment, the only sound was his quiet, measured breathing, a soft sigh in the charged atmosphere of the laboratory. Then, as if a spell were broken, the sounds of the city seemed to filter in more strongly through the laboratory window. The distant, metallic rattle of a delivery dray on cobblestones, the clear chime of a far-off church clock striking the quarter hour. He rose from his perusal of the desk, the slight scrape of his chair against the floorboards, a minor disturbance. "Watson," he declared, his voice regaining its customary briskness, "our next port of call must be this Linnean Society. It appears Miss Finch moved in circles where professional jealousy might well provide a potent motive for unconventional actions, stated Sherlock Holmes. The earnest, troubled face of young Miss O'Malley, and her whispered anxieties concerning Dr. Alistair Blackwood, remained with me long after we had departed Miss Finch's curiously secured laboratory. Her words, though lacking the solidity of proof, had clearly resonated with Holmes, for he paced our Baker Street rooms that evening with a restless energy, the floorboards groaning beneath his feet. Her observations, Watson, Holmes said, his voice crisp, however unformed, possess a certain piquancy. Blackwood. The name has a familiar ring, but before we pursue that particular thread, we must understand the professional landscape. Tomorrow we visit the Linnean Society. It is there, amidst her peers, that the true measure of Miss Finch's position and her potential enemies will be found, Sherlock Holmes noted. The following morning found us ascending the imposing stone steps of Burlington House. Inside the Linnean Society, the air was thick with the scent of old paper, beeswax, and pressed botanicals. A profound quiet reigned, broken only by the rustle of a page or a distant, respectful cough from the library. It was a sanctuary of learning, yet I sensed an underlying tension. Holmes, with his characteristic directness, made initial enquiries of a secretary, his spectacles perched on the tip of his nose. We were soon guided into an austere meeting room where two gentlemen, evidently botanists of some standing, awaited us. The scrape of chairs on the polished floor was loud in the silence as we sat. "Miss Finch, you say?" inquired Professor Armitage, the elder of the two. His voice was smooth, yet carried a note of condescension. "A tragic business if she has indeed absented herself, though, if I may be frank, not entirely surprising. A woman of intense sensibilities, prone to flights of fancy, one might suggest," replied Professor Armitage. I observed Dr. Prendergast. The other gentleman nod in solemn agreement, his lips pursed. Their shared glance and the subtle tightening of their mouths spoke volumes of established opinion. "Flights of fancy, Professor?" Holmes asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Her recent work on Amazonian flora, I understand, was considered quite groundbreaking. Revolutionary, even," explained Sherlock Holmes. "Groundbreaking." Dr. Prendergast gave a short, dry laugh that echoed in the room. "Perhaps, or perhaps an over-enthusiastic interpretation of limited data. Such ambitious claims, particularly from certain quarters, often require a more rigorous, shall we say, masculine scrutiny before they are accepted by the broader scientific community," said Dr. Prendergast. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed upon Dr. Prendergast. I saw a flicker of understanding in their depths. The air in the room seemed to cool, the scent of academic dust more pronounced. "I perceive, gentlemen," Holmes stated, his tone now edged with steel, "that Miss Finch's triumphs were not universally celebrated. Indeed, her success may have cultivated fertile ground for professional jealousy. Tell me, was there any specific research, any particular discovery of hers that might have caused significant rivalry?" observed Sherlock Holmes. An uncomfortable silence descended. Professor Armitage cleared his throat, a dry sound. Dr. Prendergast shifted, his gaze falling to the oak table. Holmes had clearly struck a nerve, uncovering resentments simmering beneath their polite scientific discourse. "Rivalry is a strong word, Mr. Holmes," Professor Armitage demurred, his voice now lacking its earlier confidence. "Naturally, in any field of endeavor, there are differing opinions. Miss Finch was undeniably dedicated, but her methods somewhat unorthodox," remarked Professor Armitage. Holmes rose, his point evidently made. The creak of his chair seemed to signal the end of our useful discourse there. He offered a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "I thank you for your time, gentlemen," Holmes said. "Your insights have been illuminating," Sherlock Holmes said. As we descended the steps into the bustling anonymity of Piccadilly, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. The distant clip-clop of hooves on the roadway provided a mundane counterpoint to the academic intrigue we had just encountered. Then he stopped abruptly, his gaze fixed on some distant point. The Linnean Society has revealed the motive, Watson, or at least a powerful strain of it, Holmes began, his voice thoughtful. Jealousy, dismissal, the desire to suppress a brilliant mind that challenged their established order. But it does not reveal the method of her vanishing from that locked room. For that, he continued, his voice dropping to a murmur, we must return to the tangible, to Miss Finch's own sanctuary, her notes, her specimens. There is something there, something we have overlooked, something that speaks not of professional slights, but of immediate physical peril, replied Sherlock Holmes. His mind, I knew, raced back to the laboratory, to the peculiar items left behind, especially the pressed orchid, so carefully yet strangely placed. The previous day's foray into the Linnean Society had left a distinct air of professional resentment lingering in my mind, a sentiment Holmes seemed to share, albeit with his characteristic analytical detachment. We sat now in our familiar Baker Street rooms, the late afternoon light filtering weakly through the grimy window panes. Outside, the rumble of drays and the cries of newsboys formed a muted counterpoint to the crackle of the fire in our grate. Holmes, however, was oblivious to these common sounds. He was hunched over the scattered notes and botanical sketches belonging to Miss Imogen Finch, his brow furrowed in profound concentration. His attention was fixed upon a small, pressed flower, an exotic orchid of a peculiar, deep violet hue, carefully preserved between sheets of blotting paper. It had been found, as young Rosie O'Malley had tearfully recounted, resting upon Miss Finch's open journal, a silent sentinel in the otherwise disturbed laboratory. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and thoughtful, yet tinged with a nascent excitement. This orchid, Watson, it is more than mere decoration, more than a simple specimen. It is, I believe, the very crux of this peculiar affair, observed Sherlock Holmes. An orchid, Holmes. What significance can one pressed flower hold in the disappearance of a woman? I asked, observing his keen gaze. Dr. John Watson added, this is no common English bloom, my dear fellow, he replied, tapping the specimen gently with a long, thin finger. This is Psychotria amazonensis, a rare species from the deepest jungles of the Amazon. Sherlock Holmes responded. He paused, allowing the name to sink in, his eyes bright with intellectual fervor. My researches this morning confirm what Miss Finch's own preliminary notes suggested. Its pollen, when inhaled in sufficient quantity, or its essence, if ingested, possesses remarkable incapacitating properties. He paused, his gaze flicking towards the fire, its crackle suddenly more pronounced in the charged silence of the room. Not lethal, mark you, but capable of inducing a profound stupor, a paralysis of will and muscle, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. I confess, a shiver ran down my spine. The image of the brilliant Miss Finch, overcome by some unseen miasma in her own sanctuary, was a disquieting one. The laboratory, as I had pictured it from Miss O'Malley's description, the scattered papers, the overturned stool took on a more sinister light. Good heavens, Holmes, you suggest she was drugged, Dr. John Watson commented. Precisely, and the placement of this orchid is the most intriguing element. We must consider two distinct possibilities, Watson, each with vastly different implications. He rose and began to pace, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his feet, a familiar rhythm when his mind was at full stretch. Stated Sherlock Holmes. Firstly, let us assume Miss Finch herself placed it there. Perhaps, as the effects of the agent took hold, in a desperate, final act of consciousness, she sought to leave a clue, a warning, a pointer to the very instrument of her undoing. His tone was somber as he continued, painting a grim picture of Miss Finch's potential final moments of agency. It would speak of a struggle, a mind fighting against encroaching darkness, a scientist's instinct to record, even in her own demise, deduced Sherlock Holmes. His words painted a vivid, tragic picture. I could almost see the reclusive botanist, her strength failing, reaching for this single, potent symbol. Alternatively, Holmes continued, his voice hardening slightly, consider that the abductor placed it. Sherlock Holmes responded. He paused, fixing me with an intense gaze. Why, Watson? An act of supreme arrogance, perhaps. A taunt, leaving behind the very thing that subdued their victim. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He began to pace, each question punctuated by the tap of his feet. Or could it be a specific message related to the orchid's origin or its unique properties? It might even have been an oversight, a carelessly dropped component of their nefarious toolkit. Sherlock Holmes noted. He stopped abruptly. Though that seems less likely given the apparent precision of the abduction from a locked room, observed Sherlock Holmes. The distinction is critical, I murmured, grasping the implications. Dr. John Watson commented. Indeed, for if Miss Finch placed it, her knowledge of its properties was paramount, stated Sherlock Holmes. A log shifted and settled in the grate with a soft sigh of embers, the only sound for a moment save for the distant clatter of a hansom cab on the cobbled street below. If her assailant did, then their understanding and access to such a rare botanical agent becomes the focus. The entire complexion of the crime shifts, depending upon whose hand last touched this fragile bloom before it became evidence, replied Sherlock Holmes. He paused then, his gaze distant, as if peering into the very heart of the mystery. The silence in our study was broken only by the hiss of the gaslight. From the open window came the distant, mournful hoot of a tugboat on the Thames, carrying with it the damp chill of the river. The properties are clear, the means of incapacitation almost certain, Holmes declared, his energy returning, his voice taking on a sharper, more decisive edge. Sherlock Holmes noted. He tapped the delicate, pressed orchid once more where it lay upon Miss Finch's notes, a silent promise of the chase to come, the paper rustling faintly under his touch. What remains is to trace this orchid. Such a rare specimen is not procured from a common Covent Garden stall, Watson. Its journey to Miss Finch's laboratory is our next line of inquiry. We must discover its source, explained Sherlock Holmes. He looked towards the window, where the grey evening was fast closing in. I knew that look. The game was afoot once more, and the scent of this exotic, dangerous flower was leading us towards darker, more complex paths than we had yet imagined. Holmes's every waking thought remained consumed by the singular orchid, pressed so carefully within Miss Finch's notes. Its silent testimony spoke clearly of incapacitation. However, the identity of the hand that placed it remained shrouded. The properties of this particular bloom, Watson, Holmes had declared the previous evening, his fingers steepled before him, suggest a premeditated act. To understand its origin is to understand a significant portion of this mystery. Consequently, the following morning found us far from Baker Street's familiar confines. We were heading eastward, towards the sprawling, murky labyrinth of the Thames wharves. From the river, a chill, damp wind whipped inland. It carried with it the discordant symphony of the docks, the groan of hawsers, the distant bellow of a ship's horn through the morning mist, the sharp clang of metal against stone, and the rhythmic creak of gangplanks. For this grim task, Holmes had enlisted the aid of a select few from the Baker Street Irregulars Sisterhood. These young women possessed a knowledge of the city's underbelly as profound as it was discreet. I confess, Holmes, the prospect of navigating these wharves is somewhat daunting. Are you certain these young women are up to such a task? Commented Dr. John Watson. My dear Watson, their familiarity with these environs far surpasses our own. Miss Polly and her associates are more than capable. They see what we often overlook, observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes then addressed the assembled girls, his voice sharp against the damp air. Our quarry, ladies, is specific, he began. We seek evidence of Phalaenopsis amazonica, a bloom of considerable rarity. Its passage through these docks would not be entirely unremarkable, even amongst the usual contraband. Your eyes and ears are paramount, Sherlock Holmes said. Led by a sharp-eyed lass named Polly, the girls nodded, their understanding belying their years. Like shadows, they dispersed into the warren of warehouses and narrow, cobbled alleyways, their movements both swift and silent. Holmes and I proceeded at a more measured pace, our boots echoing dully on the damp stones. A thick miasma of tar, brine, and decaying matter filled the air, a stark contrast to the meticulously ordered environment of Miss Finch's laboratory. Hours slipped by as we pursued our grim task. Hulking crates loomed around us, their markings obscured or foreign. We peered into cavernous warehouses, their gloom broken only by the steady drip of water from leaky roofs and the furtive scurrying of unseen creatures. Legitimate commerce, with its attendant cacophony, seemed a world away from these shadowy recesses, where illicit dealings undoubtedly festered. This is a needle in a haystack, Holmes, or rather an orchid in a veritable jungle of refuse, commented Dr. John Watson. Patience, Watson. The irregulars are thorough, and this particular needle has distinct characteristics. Someone will have noticed its passage, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Eventually, Polly reappeared, her expression earnest. She led us towards a dilapidated storage shed, tucked away behind a stack of rotting timber. Its door, though secured by a rusty padlock, hung slightly askew. Upon entering, the stench of damp earth and something cloyingly sweet immediately assailed my nostrils. Amongst a jumble of discarded sacking and broken pottery, Polly pointed. There, on a series of shallow wooden trays, some still containing remnants of exotic-looking soil and a few wilted, unfamiliar leaves, lay our prize. Crushed beneath a fallen plank was a single, unmistakable bloom of the Amazonian orchid we sought. "Mr. Holmes, sir, over here. Smells funny, this place does, but I reckon this is what you're after," replied Polly. Holmes knelt at once, examining the find with an intensity that brooked no interruption. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and thoughtful. "Indeed, Polly, excellent work," he murmured, before turning to me. "The very same, Watson, and note these markings on this fragment of a shipping label." He indicated a faint, partially obliterated stencil. "It suggests a direct consignment, undeclared, from a region consistent with the orchid's natural habitat," replied Sherlock Holmes. Guided by Holmes's sharp inquiries, further investigation by the irregulars soon unearthed whispers of a clandestine network. This network specialized in the procurement and distribution of rare botanicals. It became clear that the orchid was but one commodity in a thriving, illegal trade, catering not only to collectors, but more significantly, to those seeking plants with unique, unexploited properties. "So, Miss Finch's orchid was sourced through this illicit channel," I ventured, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "It would seem our botanical mystery has taken a decidedly criminal turn," Dr. John Watson commented. Holmes rose, brushing dust from his knees, his gaze fixed on the distant, grey expanse of the river. "Precisely, Watson. And it is no great leap to surmise that her research, focusing as it did on the unique analgesic properties of such rare flora, would make her either a target or perhaps a formidable competitor to those who profit from this shadowed trade. Consider the profile. Someone with botanical knowledge, access to these smugglers, and a desperate need for a scientific breakthrough," Sherlock Holmes responded. Though he did not name Dr. Alistair Blackwood, the implication hung heavy in the damp air. Indeed, the doctor's expertise, coupled with his company's rumored financial straits, aligned disturbingly with this emerging picture. Holmes's tone became decisive. "Our next avenue of inquiry, therefore," he stated, "must lead us to those who would have the most to gain from exploiting such smuggled botanical treasures on a commercial scale. The world of pharmaceuticals, Watson, often hides its own shadows. Deep ones at that, remarked Sherlock Holmes. With that pronouncement, he turned. We left the grim wharves behind us, the myriad sounds of the river gradually fading as we moved back towards the heart of the city. A new, and undoubtedly more complex, phase of our investigation was dawning. The damp chill of the wharves still clung to our coats as Holmes, with renewed vigor, announced our next destination. The tangled web of the illicit orchid trade, it seemed, had threads leading directly into the heart of the city, to a pharmaceutical concern of some standing, or so its polished brass plaque proclaimed. His eyes alight with the thrill of the chase, he remarked. Sterling and Finch Pharmacopoeia, Watson. Their recent financial reports, shall we say, suggest a rather desperate thirst for innovation. And what quenches such a thirst more effectively than a revolutionary analgesic derived from rare flora? Precisely the kind of breakthrough Miss Finch was on the verge of announcing with her Amazonian specimens, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Our hansom clattered through the bustling thoroughfares, the din of commerce a stark contrast to the shadowy quiet of the riverside. Soon, we stood before an imposing edifice of grey stone, its very facade seeming to scowl down upon the ceaseless flow of Cheapside. A fittingly grim exterior for a company in dire straits, Watson. Let us see if the atmosphere within is equally telling, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Indeed, the very air within seemed heavy with the scent of chemicals and old paper, a hushed reverence for commerce pervading its corridors, punctuated by the distant rumble of drays over the cobblestones outside. We were shown into a rather opulent boardroom. The rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner seemed to amplify the expectant silence. Two gentlemen awaited us. Mr. Silas Thorne, the senior partner, greeted us with a voice as dry as old parchment, betraying a certain weariness. His junior, Mr. Edgar Finchley, offered no greeting, but the nervous tap-tap-tapping of a letter opener against the polished table spoke volumes of his unease. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, his tone deceptively mild, "I am investigating a matter of some delicacy which may, I believe, intersect with your company's interests in novel botanical compounds, particularly those with unique analgesic properties, such as the ones Miss Imogen Finch has been researching," observed Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, we at Sterling and Finch are always at the forefront of pharmaceutical advancement. Novel compounds are our lifeblood, though I fail to see how this concerns a delicate matter," remarked Mr. Silas Thorne. As Holmes continued his discourse, I noticed his gaze drift momentarily to a nearby credenza. A ledger lay open there, its pages dense with figures and notations. In that brief instant, I knew his keen mind had absorbed every detail, filing it away for later consideration. "Your lifeblood indeed, Mr. Thorne," Holmes mused, his voice now carrying a sharper edge. "Perhaps such as the recent, rather substantial, outlays I note for botanical procurement special projects. I am particularly interested in any acquisitions or research pertaining to Amazonian flora, the very region from which Miss Finch derived her remarkable and potentially patentable discoveries concerning pain relief, and indeed any consultations you may have had with botanists of repute, such as a Dr. Alistair Blackwood, for instance." Sherlock Holmes responded. "Dr. Blackwood, we've had no recent. Mr. Thorne handles all such important consultations, naturally," Mr. Edgar Finchley said. Mr. Finchley stammered, the words tumbling out as if by accident. The letter opener slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the polished mahogany of the table. I heard a sharp intake of breath from his direction. "Finchley, control yourself," said Mr. Silas Thorne. Finchley audibly swallowed. A small, tight sound in the ensuing silence, broken otherwise only by the insistent tick-tock of the clock and the faint rustle of papers from an adjoining office. "Dr. Blackwood," Ah, yes, a known figure in botanical circles, Thorne replied, his voice a little too smooth, attempting an air of nonchalance. He shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly. We consult with many experts, Mr. Holmes. Our research is proprietary. I trust you understand the delicate nature of such matters, answered Mr. Sealers Thorne. A low chuckle, devoid of humor, escaped Holmes. He rose and walked towards the window, the sound of his footsteps measured on the thick carpet. For a moment, the only sounds were the distant clatter of hooves on cobblestones drifting up from the street below. Then he turned back, his voice cool and precise as he addressed them. Proprietary indeed, Mr. Thorne, Holmes stated. So proprietary, in fact, that one might be tempted to circumvent the usual, shall we say, ethical channels of acquisition for particularly promising specimens. The kind of specimens, like Miss Finch's unique orchid with its unparalleled neuroinhibitory properties, that do not appear on legitimate manifests, but whose chemical signatures might miraculously appear in experimental compounds aimed at rescuing a failing enterprise. Specimens, perhaps, that a desperate man like Dr. Blackwood, with his unique access and knowledge of Miss Finch's specific research focus, might be persuaded to procure for a price, remarked Sherlock Holmes. A heavy silence descended upon the room, thick and suffocating. Finchley's shallow, ragged breathing was starkly audible alongside the insistent ticking of the clock. Thorne let out a slow, deliberate breath, the sound like air escaping a punctured bellows, betraying none of the fury I was certain he felt. Yet Holmes had clearly struck a nerve, a deeply buried one. Good heavens, Holmes, I murmured, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. You believe they have been funding this smuggling operation, and that Blackwood is their man, remarked Dr. John Watson. The pattern is compelling, Watson, Holmes replied, retrieving his hat. Desperation, opportunity, and a convenient expert. Miss Finch's groundbreaking work, her specific formulations for extracting and stabilizing the analgesic compounds from orchis and amala, which promised relief without the addictive qualities of current opiates, would undoubtedly be the crown jewel for such an enterprise. However, compelling patterns require concrete proof to secure a conviction, rather than merely to satisfy our own deductions. The link to Blackwood, while strong, still requires a more personal testament, a direct observation of his duplicity concerning Miss Finch's research specifically, stated Sherlock Holmes. We took our leave, the unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air of the grand boardroom. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind us with a sound of finality. As we stepped back into the bustling anonymity of the London streets, the roar of the city seemed to swallow the quiet menace we had just encountered. Holmes was pensive for a time, the rhythmic tap of his cane on the pavement the only sound between us for several moments. Corporate greed is a powerful motivator, Watson, and evident enough in that den of desperation. Yet, the true nature of Blackwood's obsession and the final piece of this puzzle regarding Miss Finch's fate, I suspect that lies closer to those who knew her work, her meticulous methods, her unpublished notes on the Amazonian flora's unique properties, most intimately. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. It was a sentiment that would prove remarkably prescient. The late autumn evening had drawn in, and a chill permeated our rooms at 221B Baker Street, despite the cheerful blaze in the hearth. The rhythmic tick-tock of the mantelpiece clock and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn from the Thames were the only sounds that punctuated the comfortable silence. Holmes, immersed in a particularly dense monograph on ciphers, had scarcely moved for an hour. I myself was perusing the latest strand, though my thoughts kept returning to the curious case of Miss Imogen Finch and the shadow that seemed to hang over Dr. Alistair Blackwood. Suddenly, a hesitant, light tap echoed from our door downstairs, followed by the murmur of Mrs. Hudson's voice, and then lighter, quicker footsteps ascending the 17 stairs. A moment later, our door creaked open to admit a small, bonneted figure. It was Miss Rosie O'Malley, Miss Finch's young assistant. Her face was pale, and her hands nervously clutched a reticule. "Why, Miss O'Malley," Dr. John Watson commented. I began, rising from my chair. Holmes, who had been engrossed in his monograph, looked up, his keen eyes instantly assessing our visitor. His voice was gentle, yet held an edge of anticipation. "Pray come in and sit by the fire, Miss O'Malley. You seem distressed," stated Sherlock Holmes. The girl advanced, her gaze darting between us. She took the offered seat, perching on its edge. Her voice was low and trembled slightly. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." I had to come. I should have spoken sooner, but I was frightened. "And I wasn't certain, not truly certain, until yesterday," answered Miss Rosie O'Malley. "Fear is a natural response, child. What has occurred to solidify your suspicions?" Sherlock Holmes noted. Miss O'Malley took a deep breath, her resolve visibly strengthening. "It's Dr. Blackwood, sir. He was always pestering Miss Finch about her Amazonian research, especially the Serpentia rubra," said Miss Rosie O'Malley. She paused, lowering her voice. "That's the one she believed held the key to easing great pain. He'd offer her partnerships, but she always refused, saying he cared more for profit than for science," said Miss Rosie O'Malley. Holmes leaned forward, his expression intent. "The day before she vanished, I overheard him arguing with her. His voice was sharp, angry. He said something about her being a fool to hoard such a discovery, that others would pay handsomely," answered Miss Rosie O'Malley. A log in the hearth settled with a soft hiss, the sound momentarily drawing our attention before Miss O'Malley continued, her voice lower. "Then, yesterday, whilst clearing out some of Miss Finch's old specimen boxes, as I was instructed, I found this." She fumbled in her reticule and produced a crumpled piece of paper, a torn fragment of what looked like a letter, answered Miss Rosie O'Malley. Holmes took it, his eyes scanning the few lines of script. I could see a distinct, rather flamboyant signature at the bottom. "Alistair B. It's a note from Dr. Blackwood to an associate, sir, from some weeks ago. It mentions his urgent need for a botanical breakthrough and refers to Finch's obstinacy as a significant impediment," remarked Miss Rosie O'Malley. Holmes held the fragment delicately, his gaze sharp as he absorbed its contents. He glanced at Miss O'Malley, a silent encouragement to proceed. "He writes of exploring alternative avenues to secure what he needs. I didn't understand its full meaning until I put it with his constant questions and that argument." Holmes nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction settling on his features. The fire crackled, its sudden pop punctuating the silence and underscoring the gravity of the moment. "This is most illuminating, Miss O'Malley. Your courage in bringing this to me is commendable. This fragment, combined with our own findings, paints a very clear picture indeed," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He rose and began to pace, the floorboards groaning faintly under his tread. "Consider, Watson. Dr. Blackwood's pharmaceutical venture is, as we discovered, teetering on the brink of collapse. He desperately requires a unique, marketable product," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He paused in his pacing before the fireplace, the flickering light catching the sharp planes of his face. "Miss Finch, on the verge of announcing a revolutionary analgesic derived from her Serpentia rubra, represents his last chance, or so he perceives it," deduced Sherlock Holmes. His voice was crisp, laying out the facts like specimens under a lens. Her refusal to collaborate, her obstinacy, as he terms it, became an intolerable obstacle. This note reveals his contemplation of alternative avenues, a euphemism, I suspect, for coercion or theft, Sherlock Holmes noted. The wind howled faintly outside, rattling a window pane, a mournful counterpoint to Holmes's grim assessment. The argument Miss O'Malley overheard, followed by Miss Finch's disappearance, strongly suggests he moved from contemplation to action, explained Sherlock Holmes. A chill, quite unrelated to the autumn air, prickled my skin despite the fire's warmth. as the full, dreadful implications of Holmes's words sank into my mind. The motive, Watson, is no longer merely professional jealousy. It is financial desperation and ruthless ambition, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Good heavens, Holmes. Then you truly believe he abducted her solely to seize her research? Responded Dr. John Watson. I asked, the disparate pieces of this troubling puzzle falling starkly and grimly into place within my own mind. He stopped his pacing and fixed me with a steely gaze. Or worse, Watson. But one thing is certain. Our next step must be a direct confrontation with Dr. Alistair Blackwood. His carefully constructed facade of scholarly rivalry is beginning to crumble, stated Sherlock Holmes. The air in the room seemed charged with a new urgency. The game, as Holmes would say, was most decidedly afoot, and the path ahead led straight to the ambitious botanist whose desperation may have driven him to dark deeds. Armed with Miss O'Malley's disquieting revelations, Holmes, with his customary decisiveness, lost no time. A hansom cab, summoned by his piercing whistle that cut through the morning mist, bore us swiftly towards the respectable, yet I knew fiercely competitive, quarter of London that housed Dr. Alistair Blackwood's offices. The very clatter of hoofs on the cobblestones seemed to my ears to echo the urgency of our mission. I observed that Blackwood's establishment was one of imposing stone, its windows gleaming with an air of prosperous enterprise. The heavy oak door creaked slightly as we were admitted. His private office struck me as a study in contrasts. Handsome mahogany desks and leather-bound volumes, suggestive of a man of letters, vied for space with the utilitarian glass retorts and brass microscopes of his scientific pursuits. A faint, and I confess not entirely unpleasant, chemical scent hung in the air, mingling with the more familiar aroma of beeswax polish and the distant, muted rumble of city traffic filtering through the thick panes. Dr. Alistair Blackwood himself rose to greet us. I judged him to be a man of perhaps 40 years, his features sharp, his eyes holding a restless, almost nervous, energy. His greeting was civil enough, yet I could not shake the impression of a certain watchfulness lurking beneath the veneer of professional courtesy. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, an unexpected pleasure. To what do I owe this visit? I trust it is not regarding poor Miss Finch again, a regrettable affair, but surely a matter for the constabulary, not private inquiry, answered Dr. Alistair Blackwood. Indeed, Dr. Blackwood, it concerns Miss Finch. You were aware, I presume, of the precise nature of her latest research into Amazonian floral compounds, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. A flicker, so faint it was almost imperceptible even to my observant eye, crossed Blackwood's face before he hastily composed himself. He then gave a dismissive wave of his hand, as if the matter were of little consequence. Vaguely, Mr. Holmes, one hears whispers in our little world. Finch was always ambitious with her theories, often, I fear, to the detriment of practical application. Dr. Alistair Blackwood said, Yet it is curious, Doctor. You profess only vague knowledge, but our sources indicate you made specific inquiries at Kew Gardens regarding Erythroxylum novagranatus only a fortnight past, a plant central to Miss Finch's analgesic studies. Your own acclaimed work, as I recall, Doctor, has focused primarily on the systemic classification of Escamicota and the potential for penicillin-like compounds. An interest in Amazonian floral alkaloids, particularly those with neuroinhibitory properties, seems a rather abrupt departure from your established field, wouldn't you say? Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The air chilled. Blackwood's knuckles whitened on his desk's edge. From the hall, a grandfather clock's tick-tock sliced the silence. My interests are my own affair, sir. A scientist explores many avenues. It is hardly indicative of anything sinister, remarked Dr. Alistair Blackwood. Perhaps not in isolation, Holmes conceded, his eyes glinting. But couple that with your reported presence near Miss Finch's laboratory on the evening she vanished. a presence you initially denied to Inspector Gregson, and a pattern begins to emerge. You claim to be attending a late session at the Linnean Society, yet their records show no such session, and the night porter does not recall your attendance at any other function that evening, replied Sherlock Holmes. Blackwood shot to his feet with such abruptness that his chair scraped harshly against the polished floorboards, the sound jarring in the otherwise quiet room. His face, I saw, was flushed, and his breathing had become noticeably quicker, betraying his agitation. This is preposterous, an outrage. I have an urgent appointment. I must ask you to leave, replied Dr. Alistair Blackwood, with jerky, uncontrolled movements that spoke volumes of his agitation. He snatched his hat and coat from a nearby stand. He made for the door without so much as a backward glance at either Holmes or myself. It slammed shut behind him with a resounding thud, a sound that echoed ominously through the suddenly quiet office. His haste speaks volumes, Watson. Come, let us see where this supposed urgency leads, Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming, then nodded to me, and we followed, emerging from the relative quiet of Blackwood's office. The door closed behind us with a soft click, immediately replaced by the roar of the bustling thoroughfare. The familiar London air was thick with the cacophony of newsboys' cries, the clatter of hooves, and the incessant rumble of iron-shod wheels on ancient stone. Blackwood, a conspicuous figure in his evident haste, darted through the throngs of pedestrians, his footsteps hurried on the pavement. He glanced back over his shoulder more than once, a sure sign, I thought, of a troubled conscience. He led us on what I can only describe as a frantic, winding chase through a veritable labyrinth of city streets, his pace quickening with every turn, his path seemingly erratic to my eye. Observe his route, Watson. He doubles back, seeks the narrower alleys, not the actions of a man with a legitimate engagement, but one desperate to ensure he is not followed. He is deeply unsettled. Eventually, after a pursuit that left me somewhat breathless, Blackwood managed to hail a hansom. The crack of the driver's whip and the sudden surge of the cab saw him quickly lost to us in the dense, clamorous throng of London traffic. We had no choice but to return to Baker Street, the familiar scent of coal smoke and damp wool from our exertions clinging to our coats. The quiet click of our own front door and the cheerful crackle of the blaze in our grate at 221B were most welcome sounds after the morning's tense encounter and the city's din. He is clearly guilty of something, Holmes, I ventured, but what of Miss Finch? This chase tells us little of her whereabouts. Dr. John Watson said, Blackwood is our man, Watson, I have little doubt. His deception is palpable, but he is cunning, and Miss Finch's life may well hang in the balance. He has spun a web, but every web has its anchor points. To find where he has secreted her, and to ensure her safe recovery, we shall require a more pervasive form of intelligence. Sherlock Holmes noted. He turned then, and I saw a new, determined light kindle in his keen eyes. It is time, I believe, to call upon the unique talents of the Baker Street Irregulars Sisterhood. Their eyes and ears penetrate where ours cannot. The interview with Dr. Alistair Blackwood had left a sour taste. His denials, though forceful, were riddled with the inconsistencies Holmes had so deftly exposed. Yet, proof positive of his direct involvement in Miss Finch's disappearance remained elusive. Outside our Baker Street windows, a thick, yellow fog, smelling faintly of coal smoke and damp earth, pressed against the panes. The fog mirrored the case's obscurity, its tendrils coiled around flickering gas lamps, muffling the clatter of hansom cabs on cobbled streets below. He broke a long silence, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the room, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the distant, sonorous chime of a hall clock. Blackwood is a cunning fox, Watson, but he has left tracks. However, to follow them through the warren he has constructed will require eyes and ears in places the constabulary, and indeed ourselves, cannot easily reach. explained Sherlock Holmes. As if summoned by his words, a sharp, decisive rap echoed from our front door. Moments later, the familiar, slightly breathless tones of Mrs. Hudson announced Lady Helena Winthrop, her voice carrying up the 17 steps. Her ladyship entered with a determined air, the purposeful rustle of her silk skirts a counterpoint to the grim set of her jaw. She carried a small, leather-bound notebook, its clasp glinting in the gaslight. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her tone firm yet anxious, "have your inquiries into Dr. Blackwood borne fruit? The salon ladies are most distressed. We fear the worst for Imogen," said Lady Helena Winthrop. "Lady Helena, your arrival is opportune," Holmes replied, gesturing her to a seat by the fire, its warmth a small comfort against the chill of the evening. "I believe the time has come to activate what you once referred to as your unofficial channels. The official ones have become rather muddied," Sherlock Holmes noted. A spark of understanding, keen and immediate, lit Lady Helena's eyes. The anxiety that had clouded her features seemed to recede, replaced by a focused intensity. She leaned forward slightly, the notebook held firmly in her lap. She began to speak of what she termed the Sisterhood's network, her voice low and steady, describing a clandestine web of informants woven from the very fabric of London's working women. These were, she elaborated, diligent shop girls whose counters saw a cross-section of society, observant maids privy to household secrets, compassionate nurses who heard deathbed confessions, and even the seemingly innocuous flower sellers whose cries mingled with the city's ceaseless whispers. Their strength, Lady Helena explained with quiet conviction, lay in their ubiquity and their unique ability to notice the unusual, the out-of-place, in their respective spheres, details often overlooked by men or officialdom. "They are fiercely loyal to the cause of women like Miss Finch," she stated with quiet pride. "And they have been alerted. We merely await specific details to guide their observations," answered Lady Helena Winthrop. Holmes, his expression thoughtful, provided the specific threads for this network to pull. Any unusual activity observed around properties Blackwood owned or was known to frequent. Any hushed talk of new, secretive botanical ventures. Any stray whispers of a reclusive woman being kept somewhere against her will. The very air in our chambers seemed to crackle with a new energy as these instructions were given. For 2 days thereafter, Baker Street saw a subtle but steady stream of visitors. Young women, their faces earnest and intelligent, arrived with a quiet discretion that belied their keen eyes and quick wits. Their footsteps, light and purposeful, could be heard on our stairs at various hours, each arrival bringing a potential piece of the puzzle, the scent of London's diverse districts clinging faintly to their modest attire. The scraps of information they brought, often delivered in hushed tones or scribbled on small pieces of paper, began to form a pattern under Holmes's intense scrutiny. One reported a heavily curtained van, an unfamiliar sight, making furtive visits to one of Blackwood's lesser-known warehouses down by the grey, lapping waters of Rotherhithe. Another spoke of unusual purchases of specific chemicals suitable for preserving delicate organic matter by a clerk known for his nervous disposition. Perhaps most compellingly, a young woman who worked in a pie shop near a disused tannery, her nose sharpened by the daily aroma of baking, detected the faint, incongruous scent of exotic blooms amidst the usual acrid smells of the area. He paced before the mantelpiece, the firelight casting dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the agitated workings of his mind, piecing the fragments together with swift, incisive logic. "The van, Watson, is key, not Blackwood's usual conveyance, suggesting secrecy. The chemicals, consistent with maintaining a delicate botanical environment, perhaps even Miss Finch's rare specimens. And the tannery, an excellent location to mask unusual odors with its own pervasive stench. Yet the girl's acute sense detected something amiss, something floral and out of place. It is there, I am convinced, that Miss Finch is being held. The tannery is isolated, easily guarded, and owned, I have discovered through a quick search of public records, facilitated by Mycroft's timely assistance, by a shell corporation with undeniable ties back to Blackwood's pharmaceutical interests. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Good heavens, Holmes, I exclaimed, the grim reality of the situation settling upon me like the damp fog outside. Rather, Hythe, but how do we effect a rescue? The place will be guarded, no doubt heavily, commented Dr. John Watson. Precisely, Holmes affirmed, his eyes gleaming with that familiar predatory light I knew so well, a look that always preceded decisive action. Lady Helena, your network has found her. Now I require their assistance, and yours for the next, more perilous phase. We must retrieve Miss Finch before Blackwood can fully exploit her genius, or worse, silence her permanently. Sherlock Holmes noted. In the hushed intensity of our Baker Street rooms, with the city's distant hum a mere whisper beyond the fog-laden windows, Holmes then outlined a daring plan. It was a strategy that relied on meticulous timing, absolute stealth, and the unwavering courage of those willing to venture into the lion's den. The flickering firelight cast long shadows on the walls as he spoke, his voice calm but charged with urgency. Lady Helena listened intently, her gloved hands clasped tightly, her initial apprehension visibly giving way to a steely, unwavering resolve that mirrored the glint in Holmes's own eyes. The sisterhood will not falter, Mr. Holmes, she declared, her voice steady and resonant with conviction. Some of our members are familiar with that district, its labyrinthine alleyways and shadowed wharves. They can provide invaluable reconnaissance for your entry, and if necessary, create any diversions required. Miss Finch must be saved, remarked Lady Helena Winthrop. The die was cast. As the evening drew in, the fog outside thickening into a tangible shroud, and bringing with it a biting chill wind that whistled mournfully under the door, we made our final preparations. The familiar comfort of our rooms at 221B was transformed. The air, thick with the scent of shag tobacco and anticipation, was no longer one of mere speculation, but of imminent, dangerous action. The hunt was truly on, and the silence that fell was heavy with unspoken possibilities. A late autumn chill nipped at us as we neared the rundown warehouses. The air hung heavy with damp brick, and a distant foghorn's moan from the Thames. Holmes glided forward, a lean shadow in the gaslight. Two determined women from the Baker Street Irregulars Sisterhood flanked me. Our boots rang out on the cobblestones, jarringly loud in the thick silence. The rear entrance, Watson, Holmes murmured, his voice cutting through the gloom. Rosie's intelligence suggests it's least guarded. Our allies will create their diversion up front in 3 minutes, replied Sherlock Holmes. We reached the narrow, shadowed alleyway. Suddenly, a veritable pandemonium erupted from the front of the warehouse. I could distinguish the sharp, commanding tones of several women, raised in what sounded like a furious altercation with unseen watchmen, punctuated by the shrill, repeated blast of a referee's whistle. And then, astonishingly, the distinct crash of what I took to be a deliberately shattered window pane. No doubt, a carefully orchestrated piece of street theater. It was the unmistakable and impressively executed sound of the sisterhood's diversion, clearly designed to draw every eye and ear towards the main entrance, away from our clandestine approach. A rusted iron door, secured by a heavy padlock, barred our way. Holmes, however, produced a slender set of tools, and with a series of delicate clicks, the lock sprang open. The groan of the hinges as he pushed the door inward was a sound that, I confess, set my own teeth on edge. Inside, a steep flight of wooden stairs descended into an even deeper blackness, the air growing heavy with the cloying sweetness of unfamiliar chemicals and decaying vegetation. At the bottom, a faint line of light shone from beneath a heavy oak door. Holmes gestured for silence, his ear pressed to the wood. After a moment, he nodded. With a sudden, coordinated movement, he threw his weight against the door. It burst inwards with a splintering crash. Inside, we saw a surprisingly well-equipped laboratory, though shrouded in shadows and disarray. And there, slumped in a chair, her face pale and drawn, was Miss Imogen Finch. A man sprang up from a far corner. His voice, a mixture of shock and fury, echoed in the suddenly disturbed silence. "Holmes, what is the meaning of this intrusion?" responded Dr. Alistair Blackwood. It was Dr. Alistair Blackwood, his usually composed features contorted with alarm. Two burly men, clearly hired muscle, moved to flank him, their expressions menacing. Holmes, with characteristic focus, ignored Blackwood, his attention fixed entirely on Miss Finch. His tone was brisk, yet held a note of genuine concern. I was relieved to hear it. "Miss Finch, are you harmed?" declared Sherlock Holmes. Her voice was a mere whisper, fragile as dried leaves. Yet it held an undertone of the intellectual fire I knew she possessed. "Mr. Holmes, my research, my notes, they tried to force me to reveal everything," responded Miss Imogen Finch. Our companions from the sisterhood swiftly moved to Miss Finch's side, offering water and reassurance. I braced for an encounter with one of Blackwood's men, but Holmes, ever watchful, was about to intervene. Holmes then addressed Blackwood, his voice sharp, his gaze like steel. He gestured towards a large, seemingly innocuous botanical cabinet against one wall. "The game is up, Blackwood. Your desperate charade is over. An ingenious method of abduction, I concede. Few would suspect a panel behind that cabinet. It slides open with precise pressure on a hidden catch. This allowed entry and exit, while the laboratory door remained bolted from within. The internal bolt, a simple slide, was then engaged from outside using a slender tool through a tiny, pre-drilled hole. Then the panel slid shut, leaving no trace," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Blackwood's face went ashen. The fight seemed to drain out of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. It was laced with a desperate plea, but it failed to move me in the slightest. My company, it was failing, her work. It was revolutionary. I only meant to understand it, too. "Collaborate," responded Dr. Alistair Blackwood. Holmes retorted. His voice dripped with a scorn I felt was entirely justified. "Collaboration by coercion and imprisonment. And the Amazonian orchid, Blackwood. You placed it on her desk. Was it to suggest she had fainted, or to subtly guide investigation towards a botanical cause for her disappearance, not a criminal one? A clever touch, but ultimately a misdirection that only highlighted your specific interest in her work," Sherlock Holmes responded. The two ruffians, seeing their employers collapse, made a sudden break for the door, but Holmes had anticipated such a move. With a shrill whistle, the door we had entered was blocked by two more figures. They were stalwart members of the sisterhood, their expressions grim. The sounds of a brief scuffle echoed, then silence. Miss Finch, now sitting straighter, her voice gaining a little strength, addressed Blackwood directly. A spark of her formidable intellect was returning, a resilience I greatly admired. "Dr. Blackwood, you tried to steal by force what your own intellect could not create. True scientific advancement is built on integrity, not on deplorable theft," Miss Imogen Finch said. Holmes nodded curtly, a sign of his satisfaction with the case's resolution. "Indeed. Watson, please assist Miss Finch. We must get her to safety. Then we'll ensure Dr. Blackwood and his associates are taken where they can contemplate their actions," deduced Sherlock Holmes. The distant sound of a police whistle drifted in from the London streets. No doubt it was summoned by another of our resourceful allies from the sisterhood. I reflected with considerable relief that this promised a definitive end to this sordid affair. The chill air of Scotland Yard seeped into one's bones, a stark contrast to the recent intellectual fervor of Miss Finch's laboratory. The previous night's revelations, exposing Dr. Blackwood's intricate conspiracy, culminated in this grim procession. Heavy, measured footsteps echoed along stone corridors as Inspector Lestrade, his demeanor sternly satisfied, led the way. His voice, usually brash, now held a note of official finality. Lestrade declared, "Well, Mr. Holmes, Blackwood and his men are safely under lock and key. A cleaner capture I've rarely seen, once you pointed us to that hidden mechanism in the laboratory wall. Ingenious, devilishly so," replied Inspector Lestrade. Dr. Alistair Blackwood, face ashen and shoulders slumped, offered no resistance. The fight drained from him, leaving a husk of the ambitious entrepreneur. His accomplices, two rough-looking fellows, shuffled in sullen silence. A distant cell door clanged, punctuating their nefarious enterprise. Holmes, observing with customary detachment, nodded slowly before he spoke. "Indeed, Lestrade. Desperation born of impending financial ruin, as his ledgers evidenced, often fuels such elaborate deceptions. He sought not merely to steal Miss Finch's work, but to obliterate her very presence from the scientific stage," remarked Sherlock Holmes. A few days later, the atmosphere transformed entirely. The hallowed halls of the Linnean Society, a sanctuary of quiet scholarship and learned discourse, now buzzed with anticipation. Assembled academics and patrons of science exchanged hushed words as Lady Helena Winthrop, her expression radiant, took her place near the rostrum. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is with immense pride and profound relief that we gather today, not only to celebrate a triumph of justice, but to finally accord the recognition due to a truly pioneering mind. Miss Imogen Finch," Lady Helena Winthrop said. Warm applause filled the chamber. Miss Finch, Miss O'Malley by her side, walked to the front. Initially nervous, her gaze on her notes, she began to speak. Her voice, though soft and trembling slightly at first, gained steady assurance and firmed with conviction as she outlined her research into Amazonian flora. Her words were precise, her passion unmistakable, detailing the complex chemistry and its potential for pain relief to a rapt audience. "The properties of flora analgesica, I believe, offer a new horizon in managing suffering. It is my fervent hope that this discovery will benefit all humankind," Miss Imogen Finch said. Upon her conclusion, sustained, heartfelt applause erupted. Distinguished members rose to commend her, earlier skepticism replaced by genuine admiration. I glanced at Holmes. He observed Miss Finch, not with usual analytical scrutiny, but with an expression of thoughtful respect. The warm glow of gas lamps and the scent of old books and polished wood lent a dignified air. As the assembly began to disperse, many congregating around Miss Finch, I turned to Holmes and murmured, "A remarkable turn of events, Holmes." Dr. John Watson commented. Holmes turned to me, a rare, almost gentle smile touching his lips. His voice was reflective, lower than usual as he replied, "Indeed, Watson. It appears the capacity for profound intellectual contribution is not, as some might presume, exclusively a male attribute. Miss Finch's tenacity and brilliance are undeniable. Perhaps our notions of the fairer sex require significant revision," Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes's admission was more telling than any lengthy discourse. The case of the elusive botanist was not only solved, but seemed to have sown a seed of change in my friend's formidable mind. Just then, Lady Helena approached, her eyes bright with triumph and gratitude. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you must join us. Mrs. Hudson is hosting a small gathering at her salon to properly celebrate Miss Finch's return and her well-deserved acclaim. It would mean a great deal to all of us, especially the ladies who first brought this grave injustice to your attention," said Lady Helena Winthrop. Holmes inclined his head in acceptance. An evening at Mrs. Hudson's, amidst the spirited suffragist salon, promised a fitting conclusion to this unusual and enlightening investigation. The case's weight had lifted, replaced by a sense of justice served. The air itself felt lighter, promising a bright future for Miss Finch and her groundbreaking work. The drawing room at Mrs. Hudson's establishment, usually a place of quiet domesticity or hushed consultation, was transformed. A cheerful clatter of teacups and saucers formed a constant accompaniment to the lively hum of conversation, a sound altogether more vibrant than I had ever heard within those familiar walls. Sunlight, streaming through the newly cleaned windows, illuminated a gathering unlike any our rooms at 221 B had ever hosted. Her voice, full of cheerful pride, greeted us as we entered. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, do come in, do. We are quite celebrating, as you can see," responded Mrs. Hudson. Indeed, the room was filled with members of the suffragist salon, their faces animated. Lady Helena Winthrop stood near the mantelpiece, her bearing as regal as ever, conversing with a remarkably composed Miss Imogen Finch. The young Miss Rosie O'Malley, her eyes bright with enthusiasm, hovered nearby, occasionally adding a fervent comment. A pleasant warmth emanated from the fireplace, its gentle crackle a soft counterpoint to the many voices, mingling with the scent of Earl Grey tea and freshly baked scones. Catching sight of us, Lady Helena inclined her head, her voice clear and resonant as she addressed the room. "Gentlemen, your arrival is most timely. We were just discussing the profound implications of Miss Finch's triumph," Lady Helena Winthrop said. Miss Finch herself, who had once seemed to shrink from any direct address, met our gaze with a newfound steadiness. The ordeal had, it appeared, forged an unexpected resilience within her. Her voice, though still quiet, carried a distinct note of conviction. "It is not merely my triumph, Lady Helena, but a testament to what may be achieved when barriers are questioned. The true work, the sharing of this knowledge for the alleviation of suffering, now begins," replied Miss Imogen Finch. A murmur of approbation went around the room. Holmes, who had been observing the assembly with his customary keenness, his hands clasped behind his back, moved slightly forward. A respectful hush fell over the immediate vicinity as he prepared to speak. The clinking of a teacup ceased midair, all attention drawn to him, his words, as always, anticipated to be precise and distinct. His tone was devoid of its usual sardonic edge, replaced by something akin to measured approbation. "Indeed, Miss Finch, your discovery is significant. Yet the resolution of your rather alarming disappearance owes a considerable debt, not merely to scientific acumen, but to a network of observation quite outside my usual purview," observed Sherlock Holmes. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled women. "I confess," he continued, "the channels of information and mutual support demonstrated by this salon proved extraordinarily effective." He paused again, allowing the weight of his admission to settle amongst the listeners, his gaze acknowledging each in turn with a rare, almost imperceptible nod. "Where official inquiry might have stumbled, your collective insight provided the crucial advantage. It was not a single thread, Watson, but a finely woven tapestry of intelligence that proved so formidable," stated Sherlock Holmes. A ripple of surprised pleasure passed through the gathering, followed by thoughtful nods. Such high praise from Holmes was rare, and its sincerity unmistakable. Mrs. Hudson beamed, her pride evident in every line of her face. Miss O'Malley stepped forward, her cheeks flushed but her voice clear. "We only wish to see Miss Finch safe, sir, and her work protected. She taught me so much, and her kindness deserved no less," Miss Rosie O'Malley replied. Lady Helena placed a hand on Rosie's shoulder, a gesture of both support and pride. Her voice was warm with encouragement. "And in doing so, child, you have all shown the world the strength that lies in collaboration and in valuing every woman's contribution," said Lady Helena Winthrop. As the conversations resumed, their renewed vigor filling the room with a confident hum, Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. The sounds of the city, a distant carriage rumble, the sharp cry of a newsboy hawking the evening paper seemed to recede, muffled by the drawing-room's warm embrace. Instead, the confident, hopeful voices within took precedence, a symphony of shared purpose and quiet laughter. The enigma of the elusive botanist was solved, yes, but it was clear that the legacy of this case was only just beginning to unfold. For Miss Finch, now poised to share her revolutionary work. For these determined women, their collective strength newly affirmed. And perhaps even for my friend Holmes, a subtle shift in perspective. The very air within Mrs. Hudson's salon seemed to hum with the promise of future endeavors, a testament to the quiet, potent revolution brewing within those very walls.